At 2:30 p.m. on the 29th of June 1956, a man in a dark suit sat at a desk in the White House. He was President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Before him lay a stack of papers, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. He picked up a pen. The room was crowded with senators, congressmen, and highway officials. Everything seemed routine. A few aides stood by. The president read a brief statement. Then he signed his name. Only a few minutes later, something was different. The pen touched the paper. With that signature, the largest public works project in American history was set in motion. Cameras flashed. Outside, traffic on Pennsylvania Avenue moved as it always had. Inside, the old world of American roads had just ended. What happened? The bill had been debated for years. It had been stalled, rewritten, and nearly abandoned. On this day, it became law. The act authorized $25 billion over 12 years to build a national network of express highways. 41,000 miles of concrete and asphalt were planned. The federal government would pay 90% of the cost. States would pay the rest. Money would come from a new highway trust fund, fed by taxes on gasoline, tires, and trucks. No one in that room could fully grasp what would follow, but the president understood more than most. 27 years earlier, in 1919, a young Army officer named Dwight Eisenhower had taken part in a military convoy across the United States. The convoy left Washington, D.C. and headed for San Francisco. The roads were dirt, mud, gravel, and broken pavement. Trucks got stuck. Bridges collapsed. Average speed was barely 5 miles per hour. The trip took 62 days. Eisenhower remembered every pothole. Later, during World War II, he saw the German Autobahn system, high-speed roads that moved troops and supplies quickly and efficiently. He saw what a modern highway network could do. He wanted that for America. The country he signed the bill for in 1956 was already changing. Automobile ownership had exploded. In 1945, 26 million cars were registered. By 1955, 52 million. Families bought cars faster than roads could handle. Two-lane highways choked with traffic. Towns built along narrow streets that had never seen so many vehicles. Accidents climbed. In 1955, more than 36,000 people died on American roads. The system was not just slow, it was deadly. The answer, many believed, was a network of divided, limited-access highways. No stoplights, no cross streets, no driveways, wide lanes, controlled entrances, median barriers. Cars would move fast and keep moving. The interstate highway system was designed to connect major cities, carry military equipment, and move people at speed. It was called a defense highway system. The Cold War was on. The government wanted evacuation routes and transport corridors for tanks, but the real purpose was civilian. Construction began within months. In Kansas, in Missouri, in Ohio. Bulldozers moved dirt. Concrete was poured. By 1960, the first sections opened. Drivers pulled onto ramps that had never seen tires. They found themselves on roads with no intersections, no billboards, no stop signs. They could drive for miles without slowing. It was new. It was strange. It was fast. But as the system grew, so did the consequences. Towns that had thrived on old highways suddenly became ghost towns when the interstate bypassed them. Route 66, once a lifeline of roadside diners and motels, began to wither. Businesses that relied on passing traffic closed. Entire communities shrank. Meanwhile, new places sprang up at interstate exits. Gas stations, fast food chains, and motels appeared in places where nothing had ever been. The landscape of America began to rearrange itself around these ribbons of concrete. Who was involved? The engineers, the state highway departments, the contractors who poured the miles. But also the politicians, the lobbyists, the automobile industry. The American Automobile Association pushed hard. The oil companies supported it. The trucking industry saw a future of long-haul freight. Construction unions backed it. Congress approved it, but not without compromise. One of the key figures was Representative George H. Fallon of Maryland, who helped steer the bill through the House. Another was Senator Albert Gore SR of Tennessee, who sponsored the Senate version. They worked across party lines. The bill passed with broad support. What investigators found, if we can call them investigators, was that the system would work only if the rules were followed. The roads were built to high standards, minimum lane width, maximum grade, clear sight distance. But the human element was harder to control. Drivers who had never seen a divided highway merged onto it at unfamiliar angles. Speed limits were posted, but not always obeyed. The interstates were designed for safety, but speed itself became a new danger. Systems failed in ways that took time to understand. The interstate separated drivers from the landscape. No pedestrians, no bicycles, no crosswalks. That made the road safer for cars, but it also isolated communities. People who could not afford a car were cut off. The highways often cut through neighborhoods, sometimes deliberately. In many cities, interstates were routed through low-income areas and minority neighborhoods. Homes were demolished, parks were divided, whole districts were sliced. The system that connected the nation also disconnected its own people. By the mid-1960s, the interstates were changing not just travel but the shape of cities. Suburbs grew outward. Commute times lengthened. Downtowns emptied as shoppers went to suburban malls with easy highway access. The car became the only way to get anywhere. Public transit systems struggled. Streetcars were abandoned. The interstate highways made the automobile the center of American life. In the 1970s and 1980s, the system continued to grow. The last mile of the original interstate plan was completed in 1991 in Colorado. But the system had already changed everything. The way Americans live, work, and move had been rebuilt. The highways made it possible to live far from where you worked, to drive across the country in days instead of weeks, to ship goods coast to coast without delay. Yet questions remained. The cost was higher than anyone predicted. Maintenance fell behind. Traffic jams on the interstates became as bad as the old roads they replaced. The promise of open road was, for millions, a parking lot. The environmental cost was enormous. The carbon emissions, the habitat fragmentation, the loss of farmland. The interstates also made it easier to evacuate during disasters, but they also created new kinds of disasters when bridges collapsed or tankers ruptured. What investigators found in the broader sense is that the interstate system was not just a road network. It was a machine that reshaped the nation. It did what it was designed to do. It moved people and goods faster than ever before. But it also created a world where distance mattered less and where the car became the only way to belong. The people who built it believed they were building progress, and in many ways they were, but progress always carries a price. The signing of the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956 was a single moment, a pen on paper, but that moment set in motion decades of construction, displacement, growth, and change. The interstates now carry more than 1 trillion vehicle miles each year. They are the veins and arteries of the country. They are also the scars. Understanding how that happened means going back to the beginning. It means looking at the roads that came before, the people who fought for change, and the decisions that turned a blueprint into a new America. So let us step back. Before the interstates, there were the American roads of the early 20th century, dirt, gravel, and the occasional stretch of paved highway. The first long-distance road, the Lincoln Highway, was completed in 1903. It ran from New York to San Francisco, but much of it was barely passable. The federal government had funded some road projects, but most were local. State highways varied wildly. A trip from New York to Los Angeles took weeks. In 1938, the Bureau of Public Roads published a report proposing a system of transcontinental superhighways. Nothing came of it. In 1944, Congress included a provision for an interstate highway system in the Federal Aid Highway Act of that year, but no money was provided. The system was authorized but not built. For 12 years, the idea sat on paper. Meanwhile, traffic exploded. Returning soldiers bought cars. Suburbs grew. The 1950s brought prosperity and congestion. The Korean War slowed construction, but the need only grew. In 1954, President Eisenhower appointed a committee led by General Lucius Clay to study a national highway program. The Clay Committee recommended a massive plan financed by bonds. Congress debated. The bond idea was defeated. Instead, they settled on the Pay-As-You-Go Highway Trust Fund. The bill that Eisenhower signed in 1956 was the result of those debates. It was not perfect. It did not address the impact on cities. It did not include money for public transit. It did not foresee the social fragmentation it would cause. But it was a law. And from that law, the roads emerged. The first major project under the new act was the Interstate 70 through Kansas. But elsewhere, states began planning. In Illinois, the Dan Ryan Expressway. In California, the Santa Monica Freeway. In Texas, Interstate 35. Every state had its own section. The federal government set the standards, but states built and operated the roads. The scale was staggering. Enough concrete was poured to build 60 Hoover dams, enough steel to erect 5 World Trade Centers. The system became the largest engineering project in human history. Over 30 years, it cost $114 billion in 1991 value. Adjusted for inflation, more than $500 billion. And yet, by the mid-1970s, a counter-movement began. In cities like New York, Boston, and San Francisco, freeway revolts stopped planned interstates. People protested the destruction of neighborhoods. The proposed Interstate 95 through downtown Boston was never completed. The Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco was torn down after the 1989 earthquake. The interstate system, once seen as inevitable, became controversial. But the system that was built still stands. It carries trucks, cars, buses. It shapes the economy. Everything that goes into a store, everything that comes out of a factory spends time on an interstate. The interstates made possible the modern logistics industry. They made possible the Sun Belt boom. They made possible the vacation road trip. They made possible the commute that now takes an hour each way. The decision on June 29, 1956 was not just about roads. It was about what kind of country America would become. A country of long distances and fast travel. A country where the car was king. A country where you could drive from coast to coast without a single stop sign. And that is exactly what happened. But the story does not end with the signing. The interstates kept growing, the money kept flowing, the consequences kept adding up. The highways changed everything, and everything includes the people who drove on them, the people who lived beside them, and the people who never got a chance to drive at all. At 5:04 p.m. on the 15th of December 1967, a bridge over the Ohio River connecting Point Pleasant, West Virginia and Gallipolis, Ohio, was carrying rush-hour traffic. It was the Silver Bridge, a suspension bridge built in 1928 named for its aluminum paint. On that Friday evening, temperatures were cold but not extreme. Traffic was moderate. Vehicles crossed in both directions. At exactly 5:04, the entire structure gave way. The bridge fell into the river in less than 60 seconds. 31 vehicles plunged with it. 46 people died. What happened? The bridge had been inspected earlier that year. Inspectors had noted some corrosion but deemed the bridge safe. The collapse was caused by the failure of a single eyebar, a component in the suspension chain. That eyebar had a tiny crack less than a tenth of an inch deep that had been growing for years. No one had found it. The crack was invisible from ground level. The inspection methods of the time relied on visual checks. They missed what mattered most. The failure of the Silver Bridge was not just a local tragedy. It exposed a national problem. Thousands of bridges across the country, many on the interstate system, had not been inspected thoroughly. There were no national standards for bridge inspection. After the collapse, Congress passed the Federal Highway Act of 1968, which established the National Bridge Inspection Standards. All bridges on the Federal highway system, including interstates, would now require regular inspection at least every 2 years. The interstate system, designed for safety, had a hidden vulnerability. The infrastructure itself could fail. But the cracks in the interstate system were not only in steel. They ran through communities, through neighborhoods, through the social fabric of American cities. By the late 1960s, the highways had cut through hundreds of urban areas. In many cases, the routes were chosen to minimize cost and disruption for affluent white suburbs, but the cost fell on minority and low-income neighborhoods. In Baltimore, Interstate 83 sliced through the city's core, displacing thousands of families. In Detroit, Interstate 75 carved through the thriving black neighborhood of Paradise Valley, destroying homes, churches, and businesses. In St. Paul, Minnesota, Interstate 94 bulldozed the Rondeau neighborhood, a vibrant African-American community. Over 1 million people were displaced by interstate construction between 1956 and 1975. An estimated 100,000 homes were taken in urban areas alone. How could this have happened? The original 1944 law that authorized the interstates included a provision for urban routes, but it did not require any study of social or economic impact. The 1956 Act did not change that. The Bureau of Public Roads and state highway departments focused on engineering efficiency. They looked at cost per mile, traffic projections, and minimum right-of-way. They did not look at who lived there. In city after city, the lines on the map were drawn through the poorest districts. The highways became expressways of displacement. By the early 1970s, a backlash had begun. In San Francisco, the planned Embarcadero Freeway was put on hold after years of protests. The freeway would have run along the waterfront, blocking views of the bay and cutting off the historic ferry building. In 1972, the city voted to cancel the project. The freeway was eventually demolished after the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. In Boston, the Inner Belt Project, a ring highway around the downtown core, faced fierce opposition from neighborhoods like Cambridge and Brookline. By 1972, the governor signed a moratorium on new highway construction in the city. The money was redirected to public transit. In New York, Robert Moses's plan for the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have cut through Chinatown and Little Italy, was defeated by community organizers led by Jane Jacobs. The interstate system, once seen as inevitable, was being stopped block by block. But the system that was built still stood, and it continued to reshape American life. The interstates made the suburbs possible. Between 1950 and 1970, the population of American suburbs doubled. By 1980, more Americans lived in suburbs than in cities or rural areas. The car was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity. Without a car, you could not get to work, to the store, to school. Public transit systems, starved of funding, shrunk or vanished. Streetcar lines were ripped up. Rail passenger service declined. Amtrak was created in 1971, but it was underfunded from the start. The interstates had made the car the only practical option. The environmental cost became clear. The interstates consumed millions of acres of land. Wetlands were drained, forests were cut, farmland was paved. The concrete and asphalt created heat islands, raising temperatures in urban areas. Runoff from highways polluted rivers and streams. And the cars themselves, now driving billions of miles each year, emitted carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter. In 1970, the Clean Air Act set emissions standards for new cars. The federal government began regulating tailpipes. But the number of cars and miles traveled continued to grow. The interstates enabled the car culture that caused the pollution. On October 17, 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries declared an oil embargo against the United States. Gasoline prices quadrupled. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. The interstate system, which had been built for speed and freedom, suddenly seemed fragile. The 55 miles per hour speed limit was imposed nationwide to conserve fuel. The interstates, designed for high-speed travel, now had signs saying speed limit 55. The irony was not lost. The system that had promised unlimited mobility was now constrained by the very fuel it consumed. The oil crisis of 1973 forced a national conversation about energy dependence and transportation. For a brief period, interest in public transit revived. The federal government began funding urban mass transit through the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1970 and later the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act of 1990. But the car remained dominant. The interstates had created a landscape that could not be changed easily. Subdivisions, shopping malls, and office parks were all built around the assumption of cheap gas and unlimited driving. That assumption was now in doubt, but the infrastructure was already in place. In the 1980s and 1990s, the interstate system continued to evolve. The original 1956 plan had called for about 41,000 miles. By the time the last section was completed in Glenwood Canyon, Colorado in 1992, the system had grown to nearly 47,000 miles. The cost had ballooned to over $114 billion in 1991 dollars, adjusted for inflation more than $500 billion. The system was now the largest public works project in history, but maintenance was falling behind. The Highway Trust Fund, which relied on gas taxes that were not indexed to inflation, could not keep up. By the early 2000s, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave the nation's roads a grade of D. Bridges were deteriorating. Congestion was worsening. In Minneapolis on August 1, 2007, at 6:05 p.m., the Interstate 35W bridge over the Mississippi River collapsed during rush hour. 13 people died. 145 were injured. The bridge had been classified as structurally deficient since the 1990s. Inspectors had noted fatigue cracking in the steel truss girders, but no one had calculated the combined effect of heavy construction equipment on the surface and the aging metal. The bridge fell in seconds. The investigation found that the failure was caused by an undersized gusset plate, a design flaw from the 1960s. The system that had inspired confidence in 1956 now revealed its age. Every decade since the signing has brought a new lesson. The interstates enabled economic growth, but they also enabled sprawl. They connected the nation, but they divided cities. They made travel safer than ever, but they also made speed a killer. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates that over 38,000 people died on American roads in 2010. That is equivalent to a silver bridge collapse happening every week. The unanswered questions remain. Could the interstates have been built differently? Could they have been routed through less vulnerable neighborhoods? Could the money have been shared between roads and public transit? Could the environmental impact have been mitigated? The answers are partly technical, partly political. The interstate system was the product of its time. The 1950s were a decade of confidence in big government, big industry, and big infrastructure. The belief was that technology and engineering could solve any problem. That belief built the interstates, but it also created the problems that followed. The system continues to evolve. New interstates are still being built in rural areas. In cities, some freeways are being removed, replaced by boulevards or green space. The idea of tearing down a highway and reclaiming the land has gained traction. In San Francisco, the removal of the Embarcadero Freeway transformed the waterfront. In Seoul, South Korea, the removal of an elevated highway restored a river. In Milwaukee, the Park East Freeway was demolished, opening up land for development. These projects are small compared to the scale of the interstate system, but they point to a new way of thinking. The interstate highway system changed America forever. It changed how people lived, where they lived, how they worked, how they shopped, how they relaxed. It made the country smaller in time but larger in space. It made the car indispensable. It made the suburb possible. It made the long-distance trucking industry possible. It made the national park road trip possible. It made the daily commute of 1 hour each way possible. And at 5:04 p.m. on the 15th of December 1967, when the Silver Bridge fell into the Ohio River, the system showed that it could also fail in spectacular, deadly ways. The bridges were inspected. The standards were raised. But the deeper lesson was that any system designed by humans carries their limitations. The interstates were a triumph of engineering. They were also a reflection of the choices made by politicians, planners, and voters. Those choices led to benefits that are still felt. They also led to costs that are still being paid. The roads stretch across the continent. They carry more than 1 trillion vehicle miles each year. They are concrete and asphalt and steel. But they are also memory and loss and change. What happened to the people who were displaced? Some moved to new subdivisions. Some were pushed into different neighborhoods. Some never recovered. The interstates were built for movement, but they often moved people against their will. The system that connected the nation also disconnected its own people from their homes. What happened to the bridges that were not inspected? The National Bridge Inventory now lists over 600,000 bridges. About 45,000 are rated structurally deficient. The money to fix them is not always available. The interstate system is aging, just like the bridges that carry it. The 1956 law set in motion a cycle of construction and then decay. The question now is whether the country will rebuild what was built. The decision on June 29, 1956 was a fork in the road. America chose the car. That choice brought speed, efficiency, and mobility. It also brought noise, pollution, and fragmentation. The interstates are not just roads. They are the embodiment of a specific vision of progress. That vision is still debated, but the concrete remains, the asphalt remains, the lines on the map remain. In the end, the interstate highway system is a story about choices. The choices of engineers who drew the lines, the choices of politicians who voted the funds, the choices of drivers who got behind the wheel, and the choices of citizens who could have said no but often did not until it was too late. The highways continue to flow. The traffic continues to jam. The cracks continue to grow. And the question that was asked in 1956 is still being asked today. What kind of country do we want to be? At 7:30 p.m. on the 9th of December 1970, a group of about 200 residents gathered in the basement of a church in Boston's Jamaica Plain neighborhood. They were there to protest the planned extension of Interstate 95, a highway that would cut through their community, displacing hundreds of families and dividing the neighborhood. The meeting was organized by a coalition of community groups, environmentalists, and urban planners. They had seen what the interstates had done to other cities. In Boston, the Central Artery had already carved a path through the city, and the proposed Inner Belt and I-95 would complete the destruction of entire working-class districts. The protest that night was not the beginning, but it marked a turning point. What happened after that meeting is one of the most significant but least known stories of the interstate system. The residents did not just march, they organized, they held hearings. They formed the Greater Boston Committee on the Transportation Crisis. They took their case to the courts. In 1972, they won a temporary injunction. Then in 1973, Massachusetts Governor Francis Sargent made a stunning announcement. The state would cancel all remaining interstates within the Route 128 Beltway. The Inner Belt, I-95 and I-695 were all dead. Instead, the state would use the federal highway funds to build a mass transit system. The Boston Freeway Revolt had succeeded. It was not the only one. Across the country, similar protests erupted. In San Francisco, the Embarcadero Freeway and the proposed Panhandle Freeway were halted by citizen opposition. In New York, the West Side Highway was never completed. In Washington, D.C., the Inner Loop was never fully built. In New Orleans, the Via Carré Riverfront Expressway was blocked. The reasons were the same. The interstates had destroyed urban neighborhoods, especially low-income and minority communities. The idea that progress meant paved was no longer universally accepted. How could this have happened? The interstate system had been sold as a tool of renewal. In practice, it often meant demolition. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 had included few provisions for relocation assistance or environmental review. Cities were expected to accept the routes chosen by state highway departments and the Bureau of Public Roads. The result was that highways were often routed through the path of least political resistance, which meant through poor neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods. By the late 1960s, the damage was visible. The freeway revolts gave voice to those who had lost their homes and their communities. In response, Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, which required environmental impact statements for major federal projects. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1970 included relocation assistance for displaced residents. The 1973 Federal Aid Highway Act allowed states to withdraw from interstate projects and use the funds for mass transit. The system that had seemed unstoppable was now subject to public input and environmental scrutiny. The era of highway construction without limits had ended, but the revolt was only partial. By 1975, the interstate system was still growing in rural and suburban areas where fewer people pushed back. The metropolitan interstates that had been built were already permanent. The ones canceled were the exception. The landscape had been shaped by the system that was, not the one that could have been. At 10 a.m. on the 18th of December, 1991, President George H.W. Bush signed the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act into law. It was the first major transportation bill to explicitly acknowledge that highways alone could not solve traffic congestion. ISDA gave states more flexibility to spend federal funds on transit, bike lanes, pedestrian improvements, and environmental mitigation. It also required that transportation plans consider air quality and land use. The law's opening lines declared that the national transportation system should be intermodal, meaning different modes of travel working together. The signing was the culmination of 2 decades of advocacy by urban and environmental groups, but it was also a recognition that the interstate system, magnificent as it was, had created problems that more concrete could not fix. Induced demand was the technical term. The more lanes you add, the more drivers appear. The interstates were a self-fulfilling prophecy. They generated the traffic they were built to relieve. Between 1992 and 2010, the interstate system received its first major maintenance program. The Surface Transportation Program and the Highway Trust Fund allocated billions for resurfacing, bridge repair, and safety improvements. Yet the money was never enough. The federal gas tax, last raised in 1993, remained at 18.4 cents per gallon. Adjusted for inflation, it had lost half its value. The trust fund required infusions from general revenues to avoid bankruptcy. In the early 2000s, the interstate system faced a new challenge: security. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the federal government considered the physical vulnerability of the highway network. Bridges, tunnels, and overpasses were potential targets. The Department of Homeland Security evaluated critical infrastructure. Some bridges were retrofitted with barriers and cameras, but the scale was vast. The interstates cover more than 100,000 lane miles. Protecting every vulnerable point was impossible. At the same time, the system became increasingly congested. The average commute time rose to over 26 minutes each way. In major metropolitan areas, it was over 30 minutes. The interstates that had promised speed now delivered gridlock. The Texas Transportation Institute estimated that congestion cost the economy over $100 billion annually in lost time and fuel. On the 6th of August, 2017, the Minnesota Department of Transportation opened a replacement for the collapsed I-35W bridge. The new bridge had a sophisticated health monitoring system with sensors that measured stress and strain in real time. It was designed to last 100 years, but the rest of the system was not so lucky. The 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided over $100 billion for roads and bridges, but the American Society of Civil Engineers still gave the system a grade of C-. Deferred maintenance had piled up. The cost to bring all bridges to good condition was estimated at over $100 billion. The environment also took its toll. Vehicle emissions remained a major source of greenhouse gases. The interstate system enabled Americans to drive more than 3 trillion miles each year. Each gallon of gasoline burned produced about 20 pounds of carbon dioxide. The transportation sector accounted for nearly 30% of U.S. emissions. The interstates had been built in an era of cheap oil. They now presented a climate liability. Electric vehicles offered a partial solution but not a complete one. Even if every car was electric, the interstate still encouraged driving. The system itself was a machine that generated vehicle miles. The only way to reduce emissions was to reduce driving, and that meant redesigning the landscape. But the landscape had been shaped around the system. The suburbs, the shopping centers, the warehouses, the distribution centers were all tied to the interstates. Changing them required decades and billions of dollars. In the 2010s, a new experiment began. Some cities started removing highways that had been built through their centers. In New York, the BQE was being redesigned to include park space. In Seattle, the Alaska Way Viaduct was replaced by a tunnel and a waterfront promenade. In Los Angeles, the controversial expansion of the I-70 freeway was canceled after environmental lawsuits. The movement that had started in Boston in 1970 was now mainstream, but the majority of the interstate system remained. It was the backbone of the economy. Trucks carried over 70% of all freight in the United States by value. The interstates were the arteries of commerce. Without them, the supply chain collapsed. At 6:05 p.m. on the 1st of August 2007, the I-35W bridge fell. The investigation took 18 months. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the failure was due to a design error. A single gusset plate had been too thin. The steel could not handle the stress of construction equipment on the surface. Bridge had been inspected, but the fatal flaw was invisible to routine inspections. The system of bridge safety had failed. The Silver Bridge in 1967 had led to a national bridge inspection program. The I-35W collapse led to a renewed focus on structural redundancy. But the deeper lesson was that the system depended on human attention, funding, and oversight. All three were finite. How could this have happened? The interstate system was built on a foundation of optimism. The engineers believed they could conquer distance. The politicians believed they could unite the nation. The public believed they could own a car and drive out of the city. Those beliefs were not wrong, but they were incomplete. The system they built was a marvel, but it was also a monument to unintended consequences. The asphalt continues to flow. The traffic continues to jam. The cracks continue to grow. The question remains, what kind of country do we want to be? The answer is still being written mile by mile, exit by exit, on the endless ribbon of concrete that stretches from coast to coast. The interstates are not just roads, they are a mirror. And in that mirror, America sees its own contradictions. Freedom and dependency, speed and congestion, connection and division, progress and decay. The system that changed everything continues to change, but the direction is uncertain. The highways are still there, waiting for the next decision. At 11 a.m. on the 29th of June, 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 in the East Room of the White House. The president used dozens of pens to mark the legislation, each one a souvenir for a supporter. The room was filled with lawmakers, governors, and highway officials. The act authorized 41,000 miles of interstate highways to be built over the next 20 years. The federal government would pay 90% of the cost. The money came from a new highway trust fund, fed by taxes on gasoline, tires, and diesel fuel. Eisenhower called the system the greatest single project in the history of mankind. He was not exaggerating. What had led to this moment? The idea of a national highway system was not new. In 1939, the Bureau of Public Roads had proposed a network of toll roads connecting major cities. But the Depression and then World War II delayed action. Eisenhower himself had been shaped by his experience in 1919 when he crossed the country with the Army convoy. He had also seen the German Autobahn network in 1945. He understood that good roads were a military necessity. The Cold War added urgency. The interstates would allow quick evacuation of cities and rapid movement of troops. The Soviet Union was the unseen enemy, and the highways were a shield. The act passed with bipartisan support, but it was not inevitable. There were fights over routes, funding formulas, and state allocations. Urban and rural interests clashed. Some wanted more highways in cities, others wanted them in open country. The compromise was that the system would serve both defense and commerce. The American Automobile Association, the trucking industry, and the construction lobbies pushed hard. The bill moved through Congress in months. Eisenhower signed it before the end of June. The construction could begin. At 9 a.m. on the 17th of August, 1956, the first contract was led in Missouri. The contractor was the Koss Construction Company. The project was a stretch of U.S. Route 40, which would become Interstate 70. The ceremony was small, but the significance was huge. The work started with surveying and clearing. Within months, bulldozers were moving earth across the country. The interstate system was no longer a plan, it was a physical reality. How could a single law change a continent? The answer is in the details. The act set the design standard, divided highways with multiple lanes, limited access grade separations, and controlled intersections. No stop signs, no cross streets, no traffic lights, the speeds were higher. The safety record was better than ordinary roads. The system was called the Interstate and Defense Highways. The name reflected its dual purpose. But the defense purpose soon faded, the commercial purpose drove everything. By 1960, over 2,000 miles of interstate were open to traffic. By 1965, over 15,000 miles. The construction was a national effort. The Bureau of Public Roads coordinated with state highway departments. Engineers designed the routes. Contractors poured concrete. The scale was unprecedented. The interstate system consumed more concrete than any other construction project in history. The amount of asphalt was enough to pave a 4-lane highway to the moon and back, with enough left over for a parking lot. But the construction came at a human cost. The interstates were built through cities and neighborhoods. The routes were chosen by engineers and planners, often with little public input. In many cases, the highways were deliberately routed through poor and minority communities. It was called urban renewal. In practice, it was destruction. The highways divided neighborhoods, displaced families, and destroyed businesses. The construction displaced over 1 million people, most of them African American. The highways created barriers that separated communities from schools, parks, and hospitals. At 10 a.m. on the 15th of November 1962, the first section of Interstate 45 opened in Houston. It was a 6-lane freeway connecting downtown with the southern suburbs. The opening ceremony was celebratory, but the highway had been built through several African American neighborhoods, including the 4th Ward and the 3rd Ward. The construction had demolished blocks of homes and businesses. Residents were given relocation assistance that was often inadequate. The highway became a physical and psychological barrier. The neighborhoods on one side declined, the neighborhoods on the other side thrived. The pattern repeated across the country. What systems failed? The decision-making process had no requirement for community input. The highway planners were engineers, not sociologists. They measured efficiency, not equity. The federal government paid for displacing families, but the compensation was low. The social costs were ignored. The interstates were designed to move cars, not people. The result was a network that often worked against the communities it passed through. By 1970, the interstate system was nearing its planned completion, but the social and environmental costs were becoming impossible to ignore. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 required environmental impact statements for major federal projects. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1970 added a requirement for public hearings. Era of highway construction without limits was ending, but the damage was done. The interstates had already reshaped the country. The patterns of settlement, commerce, and mobility were set. The suburbs were sprawling. The downtowns were hollowing out. The air was filled with exhaust. At 2 p.m. on the 22nd of October 1970, a group of activists in San Francisco blocked construction of the Embarcadero Freeway. The project was a double-deck elevated highway along the waterfront. The freeway would have cast a shadow over the ferry building and cut off the city from the bay. The activists climbed on bulldozers and linked arms. The police came, but the protests continued. The city eventually canceled the project. It was one of the first major victories against the interstate system. The fight was not about traffic, it was about the kind of city people wanted to live in, but the revolt was only partial. By 1975, the interstate system was still growing in rural and suburban areas where fewer people pushed back. The metropolitan interstates that had been built were already permanent. The ones canceled were the exception. The landscape had been shaped by the system that was, not the one that could have been. At 10 a.m. on the 18th of December 1991, President George H.W. Bush signed the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act into law. It was the first major transportation bill to explicitly acknowledge that highways alone could not solve traffic congestion. ISDEA gave states more flexibility to spend federal funds on transit, bike lanes, pedestrian improvements, and environmental mitigation. It also required that transportation plans consider air quality and land use. The law's opening lines declared that the national transportation system should be intermodal, meaning different modes of travel working together. The signing was the culmination of 2 decades of advocacy by urban and environmental groups, but it was also a recognition that the interstate system, magnificent as it was, had created problems that more concrete could not fix. Induced demand was the technical term. The more lanes you add, the more drivers appear. The interstates were a self-fulfilling prophecy. They generated the traffic they were built to relieve. Between 1992 and 2010, the interstate system received its first major maintenance program. The Surface Transportation Program and the Highway Trust Fund allocated billions for resurfacing, bridge repair, and safety improvements, yet the money was never enough. The federal gas tax, last raised in 1993, remained at 18.4 cents per gallon. Adjusted for inflation, it had lost half its value. The trust fund required infusions from general revenues to avoid bankruptcy. In the early 2000s, the interstate system faced a new challenge: security. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the federal government considered the physical vulnerability of the highway network. Bridges, tunnels, and overpasses were potential targets. The Department of Homeland Security evaluated critical infrastructure. Some bridges were retrofitted with barriers and cameras, but the scale was vast. The interstates cover more than 100,000 lane miles. Protecting every vulnerable point was impossible. At the same time, the system became increasingly congested. The average commute time rose to over 26 minutes each way. In major metropolitan areas, it was over 30 minutes. The interstates that had promised speed now delivered gridlock. The Texas Transportation Institute estimated that congestion cost the economy over $100 billion annually in lost time and fuel. On the 6th of August, 2017, the Minnesota Department of Transportation opened a replacement for the collapsed I-35W bridge in Minneapolis. The new bridge had a sophisticated health monitoring system with sensors that measured stress and strain in real time. It was designed to last 100 years. The I-35W collapse on the 1st of August 2007 had killed 13 people and injured 145. The National Transportation Safety Board spent 18 months investigating. The final report cited a design error, a gusset plate that was too thin to handle the load of construction equipment. The failure was invisible during routine inspections. The bridge had been rated structurally deficient for years, but the fatal flaw was not found. How could this have happened? The system of bridge inspection depended on visual checks and basic calculations. The engineers had not accounted for the stress concentration. The bridge had been built in the 1960s using standards that were later revised. The lesson was that the interstate system was aging. The bridges built in the 1950s and 1960s were designed for a 50-year life. By the 2000s, many were past their design life. The maintenance backlog was billions of dollars. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave the entire interstate system a grade of C-. The bridges were a critical weak point, but the interstate system is not just bridges. It is interchanges, signage, lighting, drainage, pavement, guardrails, and rest areas. All of it ages, all of it costs money. The Highway Trust Fund, fed by the gas tax, had not kept pace. The gas tax had not been raised since 1993. Inflation had eroded its purchasing power. The trust fund required transfers from the general fund to avoid insolvency. The political will to raise the gas tax was absent. The interstate system was slowly degrading. At the same time, the environment took its toll. Vehicle emissions remained a major source of carbon dioxide. The transportation sector accounted for nearly 30% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. The interstate system enabled Americans to drive more than 3 trillion miles each year. Each gallon of gasoline burned produced about 20 pounds of carbon dioxide. The interstates had been built in an era of cheap oil. They now presented a climate liability. Electric vehicles offered a partial solution, but not a complete one. Even if every car was electric, the interstates still encouraged driving. The system itself was a machine that generated vehicle miles. The only way to reduce emissions was to reduce driving, and that meant redesigning the landscape. But the landscape had been shaped around the system. The suburbs, the shopping centers, the warehouses, the distribution centers were all tied to the interstates. Changing them required decades and billions of dollars. In the 2010s, a new experiment began. Some cities started removing highways that had been built through their centers. In New York, the BQE was being redesigned to include park space. In Seattle, the Alaska Way Viaduct was replaced by a tunnel and a waterfront promenade. In Los Angeles, the controversial expansion of the I-70 freeway was canceled after environmental lawsuits. The movement that had started in San Francisco in 1970 was now mainstream, but the majority of the interstate system remained. It was the backbone of the economy. Trucks carried over 70% of all freight in the United States by value. The interstates were the arteries of commerce. Without them, the supply chain collapsed. The pandemic of 2020 made this clear. When demand for home delivery surged, the trucks kept rolling. The interstates kept functioning. They were essential. At 8 a.m. on the 27th of October 2021, President Joe Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It provided $1.20 trillion for infrastructure, including $110 billion for roads and bridges. It was the largest infrastructure investment in decades. The law addressed some of the deferred maintenance, but it was a one-time injection. The long-term funding problem remained. The interstate system is now over 60 years old. The concrete is cracking, the bridges are deteriorating, the traffic is worsening, the climate is changing, the political system is gridlocked. The system that changed America forever is itself changing, but the direction is uncertain. Will the interstates be maintained, expanded, or transformed? Will they become toll roads? Will autonomous vehicles reshape the traffic flow? Will the system be electrified? The answers are not yet written. What remains is the physical reality. Interstates are a monument to a particular moment in history. The mid-20th century, when the automobile was king, when oil was cheap, when the federal government was willing to spend vast sums, when the environment was an afterthought. That moment is gone. The system built in that moment is still here. It will be here for generations. The question is whether we will maintain it, adapt it, or let it decay. The interstates are a mirror. They reflect the American dream of mobility and freedom. They reflect the American failure of equity and sustainability. They are both a triumph and a tragedy. The system that changed everything continues to change, but the change is slow. The concrete does not move quickly. The traffic does not solve itself. The decisions that will shape the next 60 years are being made now in state legislatures, in Congress, in city councils, and on the road. At 5 p.m. on the 10th of December, 2023, the Federal Highway Administration released a report on the condition of the interstate system. The report found that nearly half of the pavement in urban areas was in poor condition. The report also noted that traffic congestion had returned to pre-pandemic levels. The cost to bring the system to a state of good repair was estimated at $600 billion. The report did not offer a solution. It only stated the problem. The problem was big and it was growing. The interstates were built for a nation of 50 states and a population of 170 million. The population is now over 330 million. The number of vehicles has tripled. The interstates have not kept pace. The system is strained, the infrastructure is aging, the funding is insufficient, the political will is divided, the future is uncertain. How could this have happened? The answer is not simple. The interstate system was a product of its time. The time was optimistic. The time was confident. The system was built with faith that growth would continue forever. That faith has been shaken. The interstates remain, but the faith is gone. The asphalt continues to flow. The traffic continues to jam. The cracks continue to grow. The question remains, what kind of country do we want to be? The answer is still being written mile by mile, exit by exit, on the endless ribbon of concrete that stretches from coast to coast. The interstates are not just roads, they are a mirror. And in that mirror, America sees its own contradictions: freedom and dependency, speed and congestion, connection and division, progress and decay. The system that changed everything continues to change, but the direction is uncertain. The highways are still there, waiting for the next decision. At 6:20 a.m. on the 11th of June 2023, a tanker truck carrying 8,500 gallons of gasoline was traveling northbound on Interstate 95 in Philadelphia. The driver was approaching the Cottman Avenue exit when he lost control. The truck struck a retaining wall, then overturned. The gasoline immediately ignited. The fire was intense. The flames surged upward, directly beneath the elevated section of I-95. The concrete and steel above were not designed to withstand such heat. At 6:25 a.m., a section of the northbound lanes collapsed. The roadbed fell onto the burning wreckage below. The southbound lanes were damaged but held. No one on the highway was killed. The truck driver escaped with minor injuries, but the artery was severed. What happened? The fire burned for hours. The heat reached temperatures high enough to weaken the structural steel. The concrete spalled. The bridge deck buckled. When the collapse occurred, a 100-foot span of the northbound road crashed down. The southbound lanes had to be closed as well because the fire had compromised their support columns. The entire stretch of I-95 through that part of Philadelphia was shut down. Traffic was diverted onto local streets. The morning commute turned into a gridlock that spread for miles. The closure was not local. I-95 is the main north-south highway on the East Coast. It carries 160,000 vehicles per day in that area. The disruption rippled from Maine to Florida. The response was immediate. The Pennsylvania governor declared a state of emergency. The Federal Highway Administration released emergency funds. The city and state mobilized construction crews. The plan was not simply to repair the damaged section. It was to demolish what remained of the compromised structure and rebuild it entirely. The timeline was aggressive. The goal was to reopen the road in 2 weeks. That seemed impossible. But the contractors worked around the clock. They brought in prefabricated beams. They used lightweight fill. They poured concrete fast. By the 23rd of June, 12 days after the collapse, the northbound lanes were open. The southbound lanes followed soon after. It was an engineering feat. How could this have happened? The immediate cause was driver error. The tanker was speeding and the driver lost control on a curve. But the deeper question was about the vulnerability of the interstate system. The elevated highway was built in the 1960s. It was not designed to withstand a fuel fire of that intensity. The standards for fire protection in bridge design had improved since then, but retrofitting every elevated section was prohibitively expensive. The interstate system contained thousands of elevated structures, many of them carrying hazardous materials daily. The risk was not theoretical. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board examined the wreckage. They looked at the truck's mechanical condition, the driver's history, the road geometry. They found no systemic failure in the highway itself, but they noted that the collapse could have been worse. If the fire had occurred in a different location with different support columns, the entire interchange might have come down. The incident was a reminder that the interstate system was not invulnerable. One accident could paralyze a region. The event mattered beyond Philadelphia. It showed what was possible when political will and funding aligned. The rapid rebuild was hailed as a success. But it was also a one-off. The emergency funds were available because of the disaster declaration. The contractor worked 2 4-hour shifts. The state waived normal bidding rules. The costs were high, but the economic cost of keeping the road closed for months would have been higher. The lesson was that speed was possible, but only under extreme circumstances. For the thousands of other aging bridges and roads, the normal pace was slower. The maintenance backlog remained. The I-95 collapse also highlighted the interstate system's dependence on a small number of critical links. One bridge failure could disrupt a national corridor. The system had redundancy in some places, but not in others. Around Philadelphia, there were no easy alternatives. The detour routes were local streets not designed for heavy traffic. The congestion that followed showed the fragility of the network. The interstate system was built for efficiency, but that efficiency came at the cost of resilience. At 7 a.m. on the 24th of June, 2023, the first vehicles drove over the newly rebuilt section of I-95 in Philadelphia. The road was open again. The drivers did not know that the new structure had been assembled in under 2 weeks. They only knew that the traffic was moving. The incident faded from the news, but the structural vulnerability remained. The interstate system is full of bridges that are not fire-rated. The risk of a similar event is present every day on every elevated highway every time a fuel truck passes underneath. The question is not whether another collapse will happen. The question is when. And whether the system will be ready. The I-95 rebuild proved that the country could act fast when it wanted to, but it also proved that the system was waiting for a disaster to trigger action. The interstates were designed for a world that no longer exists. The trucks are heavier, the traffic is denser, the climate is hotter, the risk of wildfires, floods, and extreme heat is adding new stresses. The concrete that was poured in the 1950s and 1960s is aging. The repair backlog is billions of dollars. The interstate system changed America forever. That change was mostly good, but it also created dependencies that are now hard to break. System is a machine that requires constant maintenance. When that maintenance is deferred, the machine breaks. The I-95 collapse was a small break fixed quickly. The next break could be bigger. The next break could be in a place where the detour is 100 miles long. The next break could be a bridge that cannot be rebuilt in 12 days. The interstate system is still here, still essential, still aging. The decisions that will determine its future are being made now, but they are not being made fast enough. The road continues. The cracks grow. The traffic waits. At 6:05 p.m. on the 1st of August 2007, a bridge in Minneapolis collapsed during the evening rush hour. It was the Interstate 35W bridge, a steel truss arch bridge crossing the Mississippi River. The bridge carried 8 lanes of traffic and was under construction. At 6:05, the center span suddenly gave way. Over 100 vehicles fell into the river, 13 people died, 145 were injured. The collapse happened in seconds. What happened? The bridge was a through-truss structure built in 1967. It had been classified as structurally deficient since 1990. Inspectors had noted corrosion, fatigue cracks, and understrength elements, but the bridge remained open. Repairs were scheduled, but funding was limited. The day of the collapse, construction crews had placed heavy equipment and materials on the bridge deck. They were resurfacing the roadway. The extra weight, combined with a design flaw, triggered the failure. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board found that the gusset plates connecting the steel beams were too thin. They had been designed for lighter loads than the bridge was carrying. Over decades of traffic and corrosion, the plates had weakened. On that evening, they snapped. The response was immediate. Rescue crews used boats, helicopters, and cranes to reach survivors. The river was shallow in places and cars were submerged. Hospitals activated mass casualty plans. The National Guard was deployed. The bridge was closed indefinitely. Traffic was diverted onto local roads and other river crossings. The disruption lasted for months. The reconstruction cost over $250 million. A new bridge opened in September 2008, 13 months later. It was designed with higher safety margins. But the old bridge was gone. How could this have happened? The immediate cause was the undersized gusset plates, but the deeper cause was a systemic failure of inspection and maintenance. The bridge had been flagged as deficient, but the deficiency was not considered critical. The priority was to keep traffic moving. The interstate system was built for speed and volume, but the maintenance budget never matched the scale of the network. By 2007, the average age of interstate bridges was over 40 years. Many were approaching the end of their design life. The I-35W collapse was a wake-up call. It showed that the system's vulnerabilities were not theoretical. They were real, and they were hiding in plain sight. The aftermath brought changes. The Federal Highway Administration mandated that all bridges be inspected for gusset plate adequacy. States updated their inspection protocols. Funding for bridge repair increased, but not enough. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 allocated billions for infrastructure, but the backlog remained. The I-35W collapse became a symbol of deferred maintenance. It was cited in debates about infrastructure spending, but the political will to address the systemic problem faded after the emergency passed. The collapse also reshaped the relationship between the public and the interstate system. Commuters who had driven over the I-35W bridge for decades now questioned the safety of every bridge they crossed. The trust that the system was well-maintained was broken. The same faith that had been shaken by the I-95 collapse in Philadelphia was already damaged in Minneapolis. The interstates were not invulnerable. They were only as strong as the last inspection. And inspections could miss critical flaws. The question of how many other bridges were at risk remained unanswered. The NTSB report noted that hundreds of similar truss bridges existed across the country. Some had been retrofitted, others had not. The inspection reports were often inconsistent. The standards varied by state. The funding was uneven. The system that had been built with a single vision was now maintained by a patchwork of agencies, each with its own priorities and budgets. The national highway system was no longer truly national in its upkeep. At 6:05 p.m. on the 1st of August 2007, the interstate system showed its age. The collapse was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made failure, the result of decisions made over decades. Every bridge that stayed open despite known deficiencies was a gamble. That gamble failed in Minneapolis. It could fail again elsewhere. The interstates changed America by making travel fast and easy. But that speed came at a cost. The cost was deferred maintenance hidden in the concrete and steel. The cost was now due. The I-35W collapse is a reminder that the interstate system is not a static monument. It is a living machine that requires constant attention. When attention is diverted, the machine breaks. The 13 people who died that evening were not victims of an unavoidable accident. They were victims of a system that prioritized movement over maintenance. The interstates had become the backbone of American life, but the backbone was brittle. The cracks that started in the 1960s had grown, the traffic had increased, the weather had worsened, the funding had not kept pace. The interstate system was a product of its time, designed for a future that did not include aging. That future had arrived. The road continued, but the margin for error was shrinking. The next collapse was waiting somewhere in the network. The question was not if but when, and whether the lessons of Minneapolis would be remembered long enough to prevent it.